Alright, hi guys, Mrs. Kraz here. This is the third time I'm trying to record this. We'll see how I do. This is Chapter 19, Section 3, The Rights of Women. Alright, so let's start with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. This was a meeting where women gathered to discuss their rights in the United States, and this convention really marked the beginning of the women's rights movement in the United States, where women are fighting to have equal rights as men. One document that came out of this meeting was the Declaration of Sentiments. It's similar to the Declaration of Independence, but it's spoken more from the female perspective, and we'll be looking at that together in class. So after the Civil War, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two women who were key players in the Seneca Falls Convention, formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. And remember that suffrage is the right to vote, right? We just had, following the Civil War, we saw many issues about African Americans getting the right to vote. Well, the NWSA wanted a constitutional amendment that gave women that same right. We'll wait a while, but eventually we'll get it. So, although most states opposed women's suffrage originally, women won the right to vote in 4 western states during the late 1800s. And those states were Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. And you might say, why, right? Why are those specific states? Why in the West? Well, here's why. So pioneer women often worked alongside men when they were farming and establishing towns, so their capabilities couldn't be ignored, right? We've seen in previous chapters that gender roles in the West were more fluid. They were less rigid than they were in the East. So if women are doing this hard work and pulling their weight, why not give them the right to vote, right? People in the West saw it as an opportunity they had earned. And Wyoming actually took it a step further. They didn't just give women the right to vote. Wyoming refused to become a state unless women were given the right to vote in it. So we're seeing that advances in the West are going to trickle eastward slowly. How do we gain more support for suffrage? Well, one piece of the puzzle is by having more and more women take on equal roles outside of the house, right? So as of the early 1900s, there were over 5 million women in the workforce. Women were often paid less than men, as they still are today, and we'll talk about that. As members of the workforce now, women especially wanted a say in the laws that would affect them, right? So this inspired if you're a working woman and there are all these laws being passed that affect what happens in the workplace, well, why wouldn't you want to be able to vote on these laws and actually say what becomes a reality that's going to affect you on a day-to-day basis, right? So we have more people pushing for suffrage because of this. We have a suffragist named Carrie Chapman Catt who developed a strategy to win suffrage state by state. And suffragists really worked very hardly. That's terrible phrasing. Suffragists worked very hard to help win the right to vote for women. And ultimately, that's going to come through in the 19th Amendment. So originally, women's suffrage was an issue decided by states, right? On a state-by-state basis, like we saw with the western states. Women were allowed to vote in Wyoming, let's say, maybe not New York. So some states spun that so that women were prevented from voting in federal elections, such as voting for the president, even when there were states that allowed them to vote on local matters, right? If it's a state-by-state issue, how could women have a say in federal government, if that makes sense? So Alice Paul, a suffragist, met with President Wilson to express the need for an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee women the right to vote. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and this gave women the right to vote. So voting was not the only opportunity that, not the only door that opened for women. We have other opportunities coming their way. So at this time, women began pursuing higher education in greater numbers, although many states still wanted women to be in certain professions like becoming doctors or lawyers. There are still certainly restrictions, but there are more higher ed opportunities available for women. It's a start, maybe not a big one, but a start. In the late 1800s, several women's clubs developed, and they began as a way for women to work together to gain knowledge, Women would get together to read and discuss important events. Later, they raised money for libraries, schools, and parks. And members of women's clubs would work together to press for laws to protect women and children, ensure pure food and drugs, and win the right to vote. So it seems crazy, right, for women to be pushing for equal opportunities with men, but we also still have segregation playing a big role, right? So even with women that are pushing for their own rights, there was a color line being drawn. So African American women often had to form their own clubs, such as the National Association of Colored Women. Things were not integrated, even in the push for equality. And moving on to our last slide for today, the name of the game is Temperance. And Temperance is a campaign against alcohol abuse. So, in 1874, Frances Willard became the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, which wanted to ban alcohol in the United States. And Willard openly spoke about the evils of alcohol. We have a woman named Carrie Nation who supported temperance after her husband died from heavy drinking. She would actually go around destroying saloons, which are bars, and making a big scene about the evils of alcohol. You might be wondering, how does temperance fit into this slide, which is all about rights for women? Well, a lot of the campaign for temperance revolved around the fact that women were affected negatively by men drinking, right? We have death in the name of Carrie Nation's husband. We have domestic violence being increased. So in many ways, the temperance movement was a women's movement, although not exclusively. So in 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and this enforced prohibition in the United States. Prohibition is a ban on the sale and consumption of alcohol. All drinking was illegal. So this was passed in 1919. By 1921, that amendment will be repealed. We cannot go without our alcohol for long, evidently, but we will discuss that in a future chapter. For now, we're going to end it here. Have a great afternoon, guys.